Hey everyone, welcome back here to Bulletproof Selling. My name is Sean Rhodes. I'm the Chief Sales Sergeant of Bulletproof Selling and author of the book Bulletproof Selling, a guide for systemizing sales on the battlefield of business. Whether it's your first time with us here at Bulletproof Selling or you've been with us since the very beginning, that very first episode, that launch, you need to know something. And that is that hope is not a sales strategy. Why do I say that when so many people are thinking, hey, hope is one of the most positive things? Don't we need hope? Isn't hope that thing that's supposed to get us through the darkest times? Hope does have a place in life. It's great for getting that initial jump that you need. It's great for setting that strategic vision. But when it comes down to execution, which is what we largely deal with here at Bulletproof Selling, hope is where a lot of people fall flat on their face. Now, how do I know this? Why am I so passionate about helping salespeople remove hope from what they do? Well, it comes from my time as a Marine Corps war correspondent, as a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps, running around on battlefields, studying how the best men and women that I think the world has ever produced were able to achieve missions that others thought was almost impossible. Let me tell you what it came down to. It wasn't their intelligence. It sure wasn't the technology they were carrying with them. If you know anything about the Marine Corps, you know that we're kind of the last people to get any upgrades to our gear. It came down to the fact they were fanatical about removing hope everywhere they saw it enter the plan. Now, years later, when I became a business person, when I got into sales myself, I realized that for myself and for so many salespeople around me, hope was the kind of strategy of the day. It was what everybody was falling back on. So I recognized, hey, if we began to remove hope from everywhere that we saw it appear in the sales process, just like I saw those troops remove hope everywhere they saw it on the battlefield, we could begin to not only sell more, but just like the folks I was able to serve with, we could be able to serve more as salespeople as well. So since day one, we've been bringing on guests here, Hall of Fame speakers, best-selling authors, folks that are out there leading and working with sales teams to help you remove hope from how it is that you sell. In every one of these episodes, if you go back to episode 1, we use these episodes to address where hope is entering the plan, and we work to quash it. We develop a sales system with our guests that you can use no matter the size of your team or the size of your goals. And over the last 100 plus episodes, we've been able to deal with a lot of different areas, from lead generation down to driving those initial conversations, engaging folks on those conversations, and actually closing the sale, getting paid sooner. We've even got a couple episodes on that. So wherever you're struggling with hope in your sales cycle, chances are there's an episode of Bulletproof Selling with a system that will make sure that you address it. Not that you hope you find results in that area, but that you actually take action, that you make sure you're out there every single day improving how you sell and how you serve. Now, when our guest today reached out to me and said, Sean, love the message, love the mission, need to get on the show, I said, all right, what do you got for me? Because we get a lot of requests here on Bulletproof Selling. Not every single one of them is the right request, believe it or not. We don't just bring anybody on. But when I heard this gentleman's mission, I said, okay, now you have my interest. He calls himself a negotiations ninja. Now, you think ninja, like, black clad, which this gentleman is. You think somebody that, that's out there kind of operating surreptitiously. But when I asked this gentleman, all right, ninja, talk to me about that, because I want to know the background of a negotiations ninja. He said, Sean, I believe in negotiations because it's a ninja-like skill, not in the fact that we're kind of operating behind the scenes, that we're doing all down and dirty stuff, but that a martial artist like a ninja treats what they do as a practice, as something that we develop time in, that we take the time to develop, that we get better at every single day. When I heard that, I said, all right, now you're on. Now let's make this happen. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome to the show the CEO of Negotiations Ninja, Mr. Mark Raffan. Mark, sir, welcome to Bulletproof Selling.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
So, Mark, for those that weren't able to read your bio, tell me about Negotiations Ninjitsu. What is it you do? Who do you do for?
Negotiations Ninja is fundamentally about teaching enterprise sales teams how to drive and protect value within their negotiations. And I think that's really important to be able to differentiate between many of the negotiations or sales trainers that you may be speaking to. Many of them talk about how to grow value and build value, and all of that is incredibly important. But many of them don't talk a lot about how to protect value, and especially going into 2024, difficult economic times, very uncertain. You need to know how to protect value in your negotiations. And that's primarily what we do. We help sales teams grow and protect value.
Talk to me about how you got the experience to do this. I imagine you've been part of one or two negotiations that went sideways and you kind of learned lessons the hard way. Tell me a little bit about your upbringing in sales and what got you into the line of work you're in now.
Yeah, so actually my experience is all from the opposite side of the table. I come from the procurement side of the conversation.
Mm.
For a lot of salespeople, they go, "Well, what can a procurement guy tell me about sales and negotiations?" Well, the reality is, I saw hundreds of presentations and negotiations every single year, and all along the way, I wanted to scream at B2B salespeople saying, "Hey, you're doing so much that you don't have to do, right? You're conceding so much. You're letting go of value in all the wrong places, and you don't have to do those things." And so, for a long time, I've wanted to do my own thing, and then 6 years ago, I decided that that was the right thing to do. Started Negotiations Ninja, the podcast, which eventually became the training company, and now we train some of the largest enterprise sales, procurement, and commercial teams in the world.
Now, of all the things you could settle on, then, as a procurement person to help salespeople with, I'm curious why you landed on negotiations because I'm sure you've seen a lot of bad pitch decks. Maybe you could have started, with presentation styles, and that's probably something that you work on. You could have started with a price. Actually how to price what you do well, and instead of having to concede down the road, people understand what the good price is. But talk to me about why negotiations were the thing that you saw the biggest area of concern with, and that's why you dove into it for what you do today.
Yeah, because sales teams suck at negotiations the most. They are horrific at
Out of everything they
negotiating.
suck at, negotiations
Out
do
of
it. Okay.
everything, yeah, most of them are really good at prospecting, right? Like when I talk
Yeah.
to sales teams, they're good at prospecting, they're pretty good at discovery, they're good at the value conversation. But for whatever reason, as soon as they get to the commercial negotiation, right, when they actually get to the contract, all of the value that they've built throughout the sale, they immediately concede because they're so afraid. They're so afraid of losing the deal. They want to close quickly, and so the need to expedite things and the need to try and retain the deal, so to speak. And for those of you that are listening to this and not watching this show, I just used quotation marks when I said that. The reason I'm saying that is because they have no idea how to actually negotiate. Now, when I say that, that sounds like a super controversial thing, right? When I say, "Oh, sales teams don't know how to," but they don't. They know how to sell, they know how to have the conversation, but when it finally comes down to actually inking the paper and capturing that sale and negotiating that close, for whatever reason, the vast majority of teams that I speak to tend to fall apart. And I've seen this over and over and over again in my 20-year history in procurement. This was the number one thing that I saw. They were great at relationship building, they were great at prospecting, they were great at discovery, they worked the sale, they built the value, and then they got to me, the procurement guy, and it all fell apart.
Hmm. Hmm. So, with all the teams that you get to work with, then in the area of negotiations, where do you see hope playing a larger role in one area than in any other? Because I know hope I've seen, and I've personally suffered from hoping throughout the negotiation part of a sale, which I've learned for negotiations that starts, way before I'm even in contact with the prospect. I'm beginning to negotiate who am I targeting, what value am I offering. You talk about value a lot, all the way down to driving the conversation. That's a negotiation. I'm negotiating for your time all the way to hey, the sale's already locked in the bag, but I'm still negotiating for referrals. I'm negotiating for follow-on sales. There's no part of the sales process where negotiation doesn't play a role. So for you and what you do and what you've seen in teams, where does hope enter the picture more than any other through that entire process?
Yeah, it entirely is part of most sales teams' planning process. And it
Mm,
scares me because the number one question I ask them when they get to the contractual negotiations is, "Well, what do you want to get out of this deal?" And the number one answer I get from sales teams is, "Well, I want to get a good deal," right? Quotation
mm,
marks, good deal. And I say, "Okay, great, congratulations, wonderful." That actually doesn't mean anything, right? Like for you to tell me you want a good deal is like for me to say I want a golden toilet seat. Like we all have dreams, but none of
yeah.
that actually matters unless you actually negotiate something into the deal that helps you to deliver that good deal. So what constitutes a good deal for you? And then they say things like, "Well, I want to make money." I was like, "Great. We're starting to narrow it down." Still doesn't mean much, but we're starting to narrow it down. And then I say, well, what else could you want? Well, I want to improve communication with this client. Great. What else could you want? Well, I want to reduce risk with this client. Okay. Well, what else could you want? And we go through the list of things that they may want to do as aspirational goals. And at Negotiations Ninja, we call these aspirational goals. Like in January 1st, the number one aspirational goal of the Western world is to lose weight and be healthy, right?
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean anything unless there are things that actually drive that aspirational goal. So I say to them, wonderful. Okay, now we're going to make more money. We're going to reduce risk. We're going to improve communication. We're going to improve the relationship. Now, what are you going to actually negotiate into the deal to get those things? And if you say make more money, there's a number of different ways you can do that. You can increase your prices, you can cross-sell more products and services, you can upsell a premium product, you can get more referrals. There's a number of different things that you can actually negotiate into the contractual deal to generate more money. If you said, Mark, I'm going to reduce risk, I would say, well, what kind of risk first? You might say, well, I want to reduce my limitation of liability. And I'm going to say, wonderful. Let's talk about that. What can you do to negotiate in that? What are the clauses that you're going to negotiate? How are you going to take advantage of those clauses? All of those things are really important as success drivers to deliver on that aspirational goal. Anyone who sets the aspirational goal in January 1 to quote unquote lose weight has a great goal. They've set something that they can actually aspire to. It's something that you can push to. Wonderful, but it doesn't actually mean anything until you put action behind it. And so the whole purpose behind what we do when we teach people how to plan for their negotiations, especially B2B sales teams, is we say, okay, now you've gotten to a point where someone actually wants to negotiate with you. You've built enough value through this conversation where they're like, okay, we're interested. Let's have a talk about how we're going to divvy up value and how we're going to put together a contractual negotiation and a contract at the end of it. And then it all falls apart. And that's why we're teaching them how to plan, how to prepare, how to be able to deliver on that value so that by the end of it, all of that value that they've built over the sale, they get to retain. Not only do they get to retain it, but they get to execute on it and then capture it. And that's really important for a lot of sales teams to understand. It's not just about building the value throughout the sale, but it's about capturing that and protecting that value in the negotiation.
So we figured out on the battlefield really quickly that if we didn't take the time to plan, it meant that our opponents, they were going to be directing operations. They were going to be directing the mission. And if
Yes.
we wanted to do this sometimes where it wasn't just us against someone, maybe we had a high value target that was going to be essential for mission success. That's how we treat a lot of our customers in the bulletproof selling methodology of doing things. This is a high value target. This person is essential for me to be successful. Because if I'm just sitting here making calls all day, that doesn't generate any value. But it's creating that value to your point, making sure that we're doing this hand in hand on the way down the road. So let's
Yes.
develop a system, Mark, to help salespeople do a better job of negotiating when it gets to that point where we have now something to negotiate. So every time we build a new system on the battlefield, we're trimming hope away from our strategy. Same thing happens in sales. And all the systems and the process that you teach salespeople make them infinitely better at the negotiation piece of what they do. So when we're trimming hope away, in the military, we use an acronym for just about everything. So we use this acronym TRIM. The T in TRIM of this systems build that we're going to do is the trigger. So I need to know if I'm using Mark's system for better negotiations, where do I trigger this system in the sales cycle? Is it when we finally have something to negotiate? Is it before that when I'm making a plan for how all my negotiations are going to go? Where do I trigger this system?
Yeah, it's at basically when someone's interested in having a conversation with you. At the point where you're having the value conversation of what you can actually deliver, you've qualified the prospect through BANT or MEDIC or whatever process you're
Mm-hmm.
using, and you're getting to the point where you're thinking to yourself, okay, this is something that we could actually do, then that's exactly where we decide to do that. And that's when we start to think, okay, who do I engage and how do I engage them and all of those kinds of things. That's where the planning part of the negotiation actually starts.
And so let's talk about building that plan as a repeatable process, because that's actually the R in trim. So I want to know for all my prospects, and each one of them is going to have, unique needs. We're going to have to custom out, every order. The delivery timeline is going to be different. All the things that salespeople tell both you and I about why their industry is so special and unique. I'm going to let them have that. Your industry is special and unique, absolutely. But your
Correct.
planning
Yeah.
process, can be a repeatable one. So talk to me about what those 4, 5, 6 steps might be that as a salesperson I can use as I plan out for a great negotiation with any given prospect.
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about that at the beginning. So number one, decide what your aspirational goals are, right? Like what you actually want to get out of this. Now, for a lot of salespeople, this sort of seems a little bit backwards because they're so used to thinking about the counterparty, right? They're so used to thinking about the customer that they think, well, what does the
Mm-hmm.
customer want out of this? And I'm willing to do whatever I need to do in order for the customer to get what they want. And this, in my opinion, is a mistake, right? It's backwards. First, I want you to think about what you want to get out of this, because so many salespeople think about what the customer, they concede so much value to get that customer the thing that they want without thinking about what they want first. So they end up conceding so much in the process because they don't even know what they want to achieve. So first think about what it is you want to achieve, those aspirational goals, and then think about what you're going to negotiate into the deal to drive those aspirational goals. Then what I want you to do is think about what the counterparty wants. What are their aspirational goals and what are the things that they're going to drive to be able to get that? And then think about what the range of acceptable outcomes for each of those things are.
So I've got define your aspirational goals. What do you need to negotiate into that deal to achieve those goals for yourself, and then reverse
Yes.
it to the prospect. Define their aspirational goals. What are the things that you're anticipating they're going to have to build in or concede? And that's great to do that ahead of time instead of having this hit you in the face, in the middle of a call where you have to react and pivot on a dime.
Yep.
Get that out of the way ahead of time so you're prepared for it. That's amazing. What was that final one you gave me, though? I want to make sure I'm capturing it.
Counterparty. So yes, think about your
Okay.
aspirational goals and what you want to get out of it. Then think about the
Mhm.
counterparty, or common vernacular, think about the client, what they want to get out of it, and what the things that they're going to negotiate into the deal to be able to drive their aspirational goals. That's really important too, because it's going to be a two-way
Mhm.
conversation. They're going to want something from you. And if you're not prepared to have that conversation with them, you're going to end up giving them more than you actually should.
Gotcha, gotcha. Well, that's a very tight system. We often don't get a repeatable process that said that succinctly. I can tell you I've practiced doing this. So if we've got the trigger element, making it repeatable, the iron trim is where things get interesting because the market is going to change. My prospect needs are going to change. The amount of things that I can negotiate are going to shift as my company gives me new lines of product to sell, new services that we can offer on the back end, new ways that we can serve our customers. So the iron trim is making sure this thing is improvable. On the battlefield, we learned, Mark, that we had to constantly update our systems as the world around us changed. Otherwise, progress was going to overtake us in a way that we didn't want it to. So, as a salesperson, how do I make sure that I'm taking the time to improve how I am negotiating with those steps that you just gave me?
Every single thing that you negotiate into the deal that drives the aspirational goal, we call those success drivers. There's a range of acceptable outcomes that are impacted by external forces that are beyond your control. Right. So if you say to me, for example, Mark, I want to make money, that's the aspirational goal. And then we break down those into your success drivers. And one of those things is to, let's say, increase your prices with a current client. Then I would say, okay, well, what's the range of acceptable outcomes for that increase in prices? Meaning, what's the worst acceptable price that you're willing to accept? And what's the best expected price that you're willing to accept? Now, that range changes with the market. It changes with the geography. It changes with the industry. It changes with external factors that affect it. For example, something that you negotiate for in Vietnam is going to be very different than something that you negotiate for in India, which is going to be very different than something that you negotiate for in South America or North America. They could all be the same thing, but the market, the industry, the geography are all affecting this as an external force, and that's really a lot beyond your control. What I charge for my negotiation training services, for example, in North America is very different than what I charge for my negotiation training services in India. So
Mhm.
that external pressure affects what that range of acceptable outcomes are, and that makes it adaptable to the situation that you're going into.
Wonderful. Okay, I love that. So look at actually where you're selling to, who you're selling to, and the environment changes both on your end and on your customer end. So take the time weekly, monthly, quarterly, at the very least, I'd say, to examine all of those things and ask, how does the range of what I'm willing to accept shift so that
Yeah.
it's up to date? It's not what it
and
was
and be
pre-COVID
and
time.
be
It's not
very
what it was.
clear, right? Like, be very clear about that. I so often I see sales executives get into positions and say things like, well, if we're selling it for this much here, we'll sell it for that much there. That's insane. Like, what led
Mm,
you to that conclusion? You're letting an assumption drive that. You're not letting data drive that conclusion. So understanding that what the market that you're playing within change, like it would be like selling a house, right? Selling a house pre-COVID versus during COVID versus post-COVID, completely different in exactly the same market. So for
yep.
that range of acceptable outcomes, what you're willing to accept versus what you're not willing to accept changes with the market that you're playing within. Very, very important for people to understand.
And that's going to look different for every industry and every geography. So you've got
Every
to take the
industry,
time to
every
not make
geography.
assumptions. That's a great
Yes.
point. So we've got the trigger element, making it repeatable, making it improvable. And now the M in the trim model is making sure we can measure the results of this. If I'm taking the time to run your system, Mark, to do all these things differently, it's going to take more time on the front end to make the plan, to
Yes.
during the sales process, make sure I'm executing against the plan and not just doing what I was doing before. I need to justify this time investment at the tail end of it. So, what am I measuring to make sure that my negotiations are turning out better? And I'm guessing that it's not just the total value of the closed deal. Am I really getting more money? So, what are the things that you would advise salespeople measure along the way and during and after this process to make sure this system's working?
All of those things we talked about that drive the aspirational goal, that each of them have ranges of acceptable outcomes, you're measuring
Mm,
each and every single one of them. Ideally, what you're doing is once you have a range of acceptable outcomes for each of these things, now you can determine how well you're doing within that range, and you can optimize within that range over and over and over again. So you can
mm.
tell how well you're doing throughout the deal, as well as after the deal, as well as if you renew the deal. So you'll be able to see your exact results, not only on the total value of the deal, but on all the levers within the deal to be able to determine what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And that makes it really easy to manage over and over and over again. So that from a sales leadership perspective, the last thing that you want, right? The last thing you want is someone to leave a deal mid deal, and now you're like, oh, I have no idea where this person was, what they're doing. And you kind of have to pick up the pieces, try and put someone in place that's kind of gathering it. And you just pray to God that they can salvage the deal at some level to make sure that things, and there's that hope strategy again, right? Oh, please, God,
Yep.
help us in this. But if you have the system, then it becomes really easy to say, oh, this is where they were. This is what they were negotiating for. This is their range of acceptable outcomes. This is where everything was within that process. Hey, Jenny, can you step in here and just do this? Yeah, we can
Hmm.
absolutely do that.
And that means you're actually gathering data on those outcomes, both the
Yes.
things that you need to achieve in the sale to be able to negotiate within your range and the things that you've identified your customer needs to achieve to negotiate in their range. Having that outside of your head. And that way, if you have to step away, to your point, somebody else on the team can pinch hit for you. And at least they're stepping into a situation where they've got good data. They could
Yeah.
reconstruct good stuff from there, but otherwise, you got to rebuild it from scratch. So,
Yeah, and
great,
to
really
your
solid
point, the
system.
process drives the data, which drives the outcome, right? So as long as you're following the process, as long as you're following the system, everything else falls into place.
That's amazing. And that's really that applies to any sales system, but the most important piece of it potentially the negotiation stage when we're finally ready to get ink on paper, close that deal, and make sure that we're achieving both the things that we need to achieve first, and then making sure the customer is getting what they need for everybody's success. So, Mark, a great end-to-end system. Very well done, sir. I can tell that you've got a lot of practice making this happen for sales teams. If a salesperson's listening to this and they're thinking negotiations a piece we could use help on, how do they get deeper into your world? How do they get in contact with you?
Easiest thing to do is go visit me on LinkedIn. Let me know that you listen to me on Bulletproof Selling, please. That's the only way I'm going to connect with you. So let me
Yeah.
know that you listen to me on Bulletproof Selling, and I'd love to connect with you and chat with you more.
Amazing, sir. Well, make sure we do that. We'll make sure we tag you in the show notes as well so people can get a hold of you easily on LinkedIn. For those of you that are watching this on the live stream format on YouTube, make sure you're subscribing to that channel. For the podcast listeners out there, whether you're on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, anywhere else that podcasts can be found, leave a review. Let salespeople know that hope does not have to be part of their sales strategy either. Mark, thanks so much for giving back to the sales community today, giving us just a couple pearls of wisdom that we can use. Let's get out there, sir, and make selling bulletproof.
Thank you for having me.